On the late afternoon of January 29, 2025, American Airlines Flight 5342, a CRJ operated by PSA, took off from Wichita, Kansas, bound for Reagan National. Aboard the flight were 60 passengers, 2 pilots, and 2 flight attendants. A few hours later, Pat 25, a Blackhawk helicopter attached to Bravo Company, 12th Aviation Battalion, launched out of Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. Aboard the helicopter are 2 pilots and a crew chief. One of the pilots is an experienced instructor with over 1,000 flight hours, and the other pilot, with 450 flight hours, is undergoing a check ride. The weather on that evening was clear. Pat 25's flight takes the Blackhawk along Helicopter Route 1, which follows the Potomac River to the south and has several altitude restrictions along the way, stair-stepping from 1,300 feet down to 200 feet at the southern limit where the Anacostia River meets the Potomac. At that point, Pat 25 continued southbound along Helicopter Route 4, which also has an altitude limit of 200 feet maximum. They were operating under visual flight rules, but were in comms with Reagan Tower at that time. Meanwhile, American Airlines Flight 5342 completed the transit from Wichita and picked up the approach to Reagan National's Runway 1. They were also being controlled by Reagan Tower, but on a different frequency than Pat 25. We now know that 5342's captain was Jonathan Campos, 34 years old, who had worked with the airline for 6 years, and the first officer was Samuel Lilly, who is 28 years old, who had worked with the airline for 2 years. Here are the actual radio comms during the approach between the CRJ that used the call sign Blue Streak and Reagan Tower.
Tower 5342 on Mount Vernon visual runway 1.
Blue Streak 5342, Washington Tower 1 star 320 17, got 25, you take runway 33. Blue Streak 5178, let's turn this Sierra ground 17. Let's Sierra ground 17, 5017.
Yeah, we can do 33 for Blue Streak 5342.
Blue Streak 5342, that's Wilson Bridge, change to turn for runway 33, clear to land.
As we mentioned in the last episode, the runway 33 approach is challenging in that it's a tight circling one that takes aircraft from an altitude of 1,700 feet at the initial approach fix over the Potomac River, which is 3.6 nautical miles south of the airport, to an altitude of 490 feet at the visual guidance fix over land east of the river, 0.6 nautical miles from the field. Meanwhile, the tower controller, who we now know was working 2 scopes, which the FAA has said is not normal but is permitted, one scope working the airliners approaching the airport and the other one controlling the helicopters flying VFR in the area, gets a collision avoidance indication, which leads to this exchange with the Blackhawk, which is on a different frequency than the one Blue Streak 5342 is on.
S25, get the CRJ in flight. S25, have fun at CRJ.
This club has an aircraft insight precedent separation.
Several camera views captured what happened next at approximately 8:48 p.m. Here's the view from the Kennedy Center. And here's that same view zoomed in. Here's a view from somebody who is driving onto Joint Base Bowling, which is across the river due east of DCA. And here's footage taken by several bystanders on the airport side of the river. And here's another view from a security camera at the airport, which it turns out was leaked to CNN by an airport employee without authorization. That employee is now facing legal consequences as a result. There have been a few developments since our last episode about this tragedy. First is after the family's initial request that the U.S. Army not identify the Blackhawk co-pilot because of fears for their safety, let me just say that the fact that they felt like they had to do that instead of being able to honor her service at the outset like the families of the other 2 soldiers who died in the crash were allowed to is obscene, to put it mildly. A few days later, they reversed their request and let officials publicize her identity. Captain Rebecca Lobach was 28 years old when she was killed in the midair. She enlisted in the Army in 2018 as a simultaneous membership program cadet, which allows cadets to take part in both the Reserve Officer Training Corps and the National Guard at the same time, and she attended Sewanee, the University of the South. She subsequently transferred to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She was commissioned at UNC through ROTC as a distinguished military graduate in 2019. At the time of the mishap on January 29th, she was a qualified pilot in command with 450 hours in the Blackhawk and was serving as the 12th Aviation Battalion's executive officer. She was also a military volunteer at the White House, which is a prestigious honor only offered to top officers and something she did over and above her squadron duties. Here she is assisting then-President Biden with giving the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Ralph Lauren on January 4th of this year. Among the awards she received during her 5.5 years of service were the Army Commendation Medal and the Army Achievement Medal. In a statement her family released through the Army, they described her as a bright star in all of our lives. She was kind, generous, brilliant, funny, ambitious, and strong. Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Eves, 39 years old, of Great Mills, Maryland, who was the instructor pilot, and Staff Sergeant Ryan Austin O'Hara, 28 years old, of Lilburn, Georgia, who was the crew chief, were killed in the crash along with Captain Lobach. The NTSB hasn't released its complete initial report, but did verify that they've recovered the black boxes, and initial data analysis confirmed the route of flight of both aircraft until the midair, and that the Blackhawk was at an altitude of 300 feet when it collided with the CRJ, 100 feet higher than the maximum allowed when flying on helicopter Route 4. The NTSB also said that their initial data analysis showed that about 19 seconds before impact, the crew of Flight 5342 received an automated traffic advisory alert from the TCAS system. Data from the flight recorder showed the PSA jet pitched up about 1 second before impact, but investigators did not say whether this was an attempted evasive maneuver by the PSA pilots. The NTSB also revealed that the model Blackhawk the Army crew was flying was a UH-60L, which is an older model without autopilot, which means whoever was at the controls was hand-flying the helicopter. This is a picture of the actual helicopter that crashed, Bureau number 00 TAC 26860. All 67 bodies of the victims have been recovered, which gives some measure of closure to families and loved ones, and the wreckage of both the CRJ and the Blackhawk have been pulled from the Potomac River. The other details, specifically those that will indicate what was going on in both cockpits, and in the case of the Blackhawk, who was at the controls at the time of impact, will come out when the NTSB releases its final report, and we'll relay those findings once they're available. So if you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.